This understanding highlights the Constitution as an essential but limited tool in reducing gender-based disparities. Constitutions really are expected to regulate and support the advancement of gender equality in different ways. In essence, constitutional provisions that specifically protect men and women's rights have the tendency to shape the content of legislation, policies, programs, and even practice, and thus that are articulate and promote gender rights and equal opportunity, make a clear statement regarding what a nation values, its commitments to citizens, and a pointer to persons that might resist policies that promote gender equality. Now, while the impacts of gender-inclusive constitutions on policy and legislative reforms can contribute to practical gender equality advancement efforts, such efforts alone are yet to show any meaningful success in most African countries. For example, in South Africa, we see an extensive use of law to address gender-based inequalities, but the redistribution based on substantive rights and benefits that could even redress gender economic inequalities remain limited and insufficient. Again, in 2018, the Tunisian parliament passed an inheritance law requiring equal male and female heirs to receive equal inheritance. But it is unfortunate that many family members are not recognizing the existent law, thus creating obstacles for the economic advancement of women and gender economic equalities. Even in Nigeria, with the case of Ukeje versus Ukeje, that has made it mandatory that women should be allowed to inherit property from their family. Most families still push back on these decisions of the courts. So as such, even where law responds positively to gender equality, its impacts could be limited, either because the law is not exploited to address structural inequalities, or that honest decisions on how to change women and men's life have not been taken seriously. The extent to which constitutions serve as effective triggers will always depend on whether and how they are embedded within the socio-economic and political environment. More so, far-reaching policies and practical change in support of gender equality occur only when opportunities afforded by constitutional changes are exploited to address the structural conditions that create and perpetuate systemic inequalities.
Dr. May, you have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So this is the basic argument. The basic argument really is that when we look at the society, we look at the socio-political and cultural environment, we tend to see a lot of abuses despite the existence of laws and policies. And so it becomes important to move beyond law to begin to look for solutions. And these disparities we see in our families, we also see even in our livelihoods and with respect to customary laws as they exist. And because of time, I might not get into all the realities on ground. But then the recommendation or the way out is for us as Africans, as lawyers, to adopt a grassroots justice movement approach towards the realization of inclusive empowerment for men and women. It is an approach really that requires a change in mindset by individuals in the society. And this has to start from the family, and then to the schools, churches, and our communities, and then institutions of government. But when we look at society, a lot of violence is happening. The discrimination and abuse also exist. Some remain subtle, some are so obvious. The violence and abuse is not just about the physical. It is also about what it does to men and women mentally. It also affects children, and also affects women's sense of self, their family values and community, and indeed sustainable development outcomes. So changing the ways in which we engage men and boys in gender equality and women integration efforts is essential to achieving inclusive development objectives and long-lasting change. It's also necessary that we involve men to play critical roles in challenging inequitable norms and power dynamics, given their positions in the families, in the communities, in the institutions, and other relationships. We also need to start to live in a community of substantive equality, where we look at context and background with respect to issues of distribution and redistribution. By preventing systemic discrimination, happier men and happier women will become uniquely positioned to participate meaningfully in enduring inclusive outcomes. We must also begin to raise children differently, away from existing stereotypes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ume. Please let us clap some hands. Round of applause to Dr. Ume. I want us to open up now for the next 10 to 15 minutes for questions and reflections on these presentations on inclusivity and socioeconomic development. And I want to post a few questions as a first round of questions to all the panelists, and then I will give the opportunity to the participants, the delegates, to also, if they have questions or reflections, make those reflections. My first one would go to you, Dr. Ume, and that is around the question of language. How important is gender-specific language, especially in laws, for sustainable development? I've heard in your presentation you raised the dangers of gender-neutral language in achieving sustainable development for women and so forth. So my question is, what significance does express use or express language in a gender context have for sustainable development? But I also want to pose a second question to you, and that also goes to Mr. Oz and our first presenter, Dr. Ozumena, and that is law really the solution to gender equality? In the context of Mr. Oz, in the context of intergenerational justice, is law the most appropriate means in which we can achieve gender equality and intergenerational justice? To Dr. Dimana, I want to ask on the question of participation. We are sadly or fortunately moving into a new world order where digital space, use of technology is an important means or mode of participation. What are the limits and implications of digital participation, especially if you look at it in the context of inequality and people who do not have access, economic resources and so forth to technology, and increasingly states using technological means and platforms as a means of participation and consultation with members of society? Those are my questions. I want to open up now. Any questions from the participants? Reflections, comments? There is one at the back.
Agency, presence, essentially, whether it's about women or the future generation or broadly the broader public in terms of influencing policy. So it was a really important theme in that sense. Now, in terms of either comment or question, I think it would be useful to use as the starting point either the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and perhaps more appropriately, for those talking about gender, using the Protocol on Women's Rights, but particularly for John and Annalie, I think the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance provides a good framework. If you look at Article 3, 30, 31, it talks about participation in development. And so using that as a springboard, I think, can enrich the assessment. The same for John, the Article 42, I think, speaks directly about sustainable environment and how that is necessary to benefit not just the present generation, but the future generation. So I think that can serve as a springboard. But question, I think so, in terms of generational issues, John, one of the main challenges is that democracy is unfortunately about today's people voting, holding the government accountable, and all of that. And so whether it's about the future generation or whether it's about public date, there is that tension between democracy and the future. So how can we try and balance that tension in a way that does not constrain the value of democracy in the modern world? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? There's one on this side of the house.
My name is John Nakuta, and I'm from. Questions to John and Annalie. Annalie, you spoke about the importance of effective participation. In our country, we've got the situation, statement by senior politicians saying that by the time you elected us, you actually delegated your sovereignty to us. So we actually are there, and we are really in a position to take decisions in your best interest. And I'm linking this with what John have said. It's like we have discovered, as you say, as you've rightfully mentioned, oil, and we're going into this dilemma. I call it the dichotomy, that we want development, and we are your elected leaders, and we actually know, that is the attitude, we know what is best. How do we cross that hurdle so as to message that are actually given to the people by way of this being their inalienable rights? Yeah? Thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Taman has also a question.
Thank you. I know the panel don't normally ask questions, but I do actually have something that I really want to ask my colleague here, John. So you spoke about customary law, and I do completely agree with you that customary law should form the basis of that. Customary law do have a place in our constitutions, but if you look at climate change, which is a global issue, and foreseeing that international law would be one of the options, and if so, what is this place? If not, do you foresee it having a place in international law? Thank you.
I think if there are no more questions, we can start with our panelists online. 2-3 minutes in response, and then we'll come back to the two panelists with us in person.
Okay. I wonder if I should start?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. You asked the question, is law really the most appropriate means to achieve gender equality? I'll start by saying I am from that school of thought that law is not the, not law, but legislative tool as the most appropriate tool to achieve certain aims and objectives. And I did in a paper in 2014, 2015, articulate this properly in that paper. Owing to the legislative tools used in South Africa, to achieve gender equality. So I'm from that school of thought that in certain circumstances, law may not, or legislative tool may not be the appropriate means. But then if we understand the role of law in protecting and promoting gender equality, law produces the force that ensures that we obey the law. So without law to force individuals to obey certain prescripts, it would be really difficult to start with the idea of promotion and protection. Therefore, I would be in the middle to say that in certain circumstances, law may not be the appropriate means, whilst in others, it is important to enforce, because leaving individuals to their own devices will create anarchy. And so law has its role to play in ensuring enforcement. And so it is important also for law to be a tool in achieving gender equality. Thank you.
Prof, maybe if I just also ask a follow-up question to you, and that is, in the context of South Africa specifically, since your presentation was more focused on South Africa, the colonial legacy of apartheid, which obviously we know has a lot of economical implications, does apartheid have a gender dimension to it?
Sorry, I didn't get the last thing.
My last comment was, does that legacy of apartheid, does it have a gender dimension to it?
Oh, definitely, indeed. And that was one of the things I mentioned, to say that gender inequality has so many intersectionalities. For example, in terms of labor force in South Africa, you have Black South Africans representing 40% of unemployment, whereas it is about 12% for other race, being white, 11 for colored. And so you find that Black Africans have the highest percentage of unemployment. So yes, definitely, the previous administration, the historic past of South Africa, plays a huge role in creating and recreating the gender inequalities that we see in the country. And that is why the country tends to move towards the idea or the concept of substantive equality. In other words, to look at circumstances that will address the imbalances of the past. And so, yes, indeed, you are quite correct to say that the historic legacy of apartheid has a huge role to play in sustaining the gender inequalities in South Africa.
Thank you. We can proceed with...
So just to answer your question first about the digital spaces, so that was one of the recommendations that I wanted to mention, that the internet, social media, digital spaces can and should indeed be used to create new spaces for participation. It is there, it is out there. I mean, the amount of people that you can get, the voices that you can get, it's something that should indeed be employed. But whoever the development actors are that's involved in a development program should be conscious of the fact that not everyone does have access to these technological the spaces that they have. So when I did briefly speak about different participatory spaces, so when a development project is being launched, it is very important to identify especially who is the different beneficiaries of different development projects and what is the different spaces that is available and most accessible to the different beneficiaries. So although it is a very important tool that can be employed, it should not be exclusively employed, but should still take account of everyone that is part of the development project. Then to move on about the question about our government officials and when they say that they are elected for us, I think you know, I am, and I think most people here, you know, of course we're all for democracy and democratic principles, but we should always remember that democracy itself doesn't come without its own shortcomings. And I think the one issue that I have is when you have government officials that are appointed for 4 or 5 years based on promises that they made during a campaign, is how do you keep them accountable? And for me, that is where human rights comes in, and it's keeping them accountable to the human rights that people have. And when you link participation and development to human rights, that creates the platform to keep them accountable for the development projects. And when you see participation as a key human right that they have to adhere to, even while they are in government, that I think that is one of the solutions that I can offer, maybe to the question that you posed.
Thank you.
First, I would say to the question about law and social problems, I don't think law is a solution to anything, or at least not the whole solution. I would say it's, you know, the classic necessary but not sufficient to address any social problem. You know, law can certainly be an impediment to social change and perhaps helpful as well, but for the most part, you know, this really happens at policy levels and with political will, and that's where money is allocated, and that's where what priorities are, you know, set by a government about what it really cares about. So, yeah, just for that one. Adam's point about voice was really insightful, and I think, you know, for environmental and natural resource use, the voice that's often, if not almost always left out, is that of the very local community where these actual resources are, where they're managed and used on a daily basis. You know, there's, of course, within international law and in most constitutions now, the idea of prior informed consent and what that is and how it has to be meaningful for local communities, and this idea of decentralization that is in a lot of constitutional thought as well now, where leave it to the local communities to manage these resources, provided they're not doing it something egregious that's harming, you know, the future generations or the state. And the communal conservancies, which I spoke about earlier in Namibia, are such a fascinating example where local communities can form their own conservancy with their own constitution, their own rules of governance and order, and in response to that, they're allowed wildlife rights where they're allowed to manage these resources and benefit them and then distribute the resources how they want within their own communities, which I think is just an absolutely fascinating experiment in kind of lowercase d democracy. But, you know, for this question about balance between democracy and intergenerational justice, I mean, that's a hard one, but I think, you know, your answer would be, or at least my answer would be, within any legitimate democracy, there's fundamental human rights and constitutional rights that are not subject to debate, and they are protected from, you know, simple popular vote of going by the wayside. And I would, you know, I would at least argue that this includes enforcing rights that are focused on the environment and are intergenerational in nature. To your question about customary law and international law, I'm truly stumped. I remember reading about Namibia's inclusion of customary law within the Constitution as being phrased, I think, as a parallel non-state judicial system, which I think is a really good way of framing that. And, you know, like, this is how the law is actually, you know, carried out in many rural communities, you know, which probably know or care very little about international law. It's really hard for me to see how that would be included in international law as a matter of law between states as opposed to constitutional law, but it's a really interesting question, and I am thinking about it.
Good. Dr. Ume?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kersberg. To answer your question on the use of specific gender language, I would say that gender-specific language serves as a kind of a directing element, you know, in constitutions because of its tendency to shape the content of legislation, policies, and even programs. When the language is definite, it becomes difficult to change the interpretation with respect to what our judges do in the courts. And this will go a long way to provide an enhanced possibility of decisions that can be beneficial to men and women as far as the right to equality is concerned. Thank you.
There's one more question or comment. Any other questions? Yes, there is one.
Thank you, Doc. Hi, Rita. Hi, Ngozi. Serge here. I have a question.
Hi, Prof.
Hi. I have a question here that will speak to you, to Rita, and certainly to John. Is this perhaps the same question? And when Rita said she believes that there are cases where we don't need perhaps to rely on law, the question that I wanted to ask was, in which case you then don't rely on law, and the other way around, when do you just rely on the local context? And I'm asking this question because what will be the standards to follow? Perhaps to explain my question further, when you have to report to UN bodies or to the African Commission on what you've done to give effect to women's rights, are you able to say, I was simply relying on the social context to give effect to this? If so, how will you do that? And this also is linked to the question to John on democracy and human rights, because in all societies, as you correctly pointed out, if there is democracy, some human rights and constitutional rights are expected. The question for me will be, in the Arab world, for instance, people will say, but we do this according to our culture. And it's their way of resolving their social problems using relying in their views on the normative standard. Hence, we often have reservation with states signing some of these treaties. How do we ensure that communities or states are officially allowed to rely on social institutions in religions, traditional leadership, to enforce the rule of law? Meaning, we subscribe to the rule of law, but to what extent can we say I was relying on my custom to give effect to this, and that this makes sense at international level? Yeah. And lastly, my last point is to Ngozi, on your response. I think when gender issues are put in legal documents, it kind of shines some light on the issues. It ensures the visibility of discrimination, if discrimination is there. I don't know what your view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, you can go ahead.
Do I need to respond?
Yes, please, Prof. Doc.
Okay, Prof, I quite agree with you with respect to gender equality legislation. but most times you find out that gender has a history. And because of that, basically because of that history, there is need to have this, the rights articulated expressly so that it would begin to serve as a focus or as a direction for legislation and for interpretation by the courts. So I quite agree with you.
Good. Thank you. I will. We are running out of time, so we won't be able to take questions and reflections now. But we want to give the opportunity to the panelists to respond and then make closing remarks because we are out of time.
Serge, why would you ask such a difficult question at the end of the day when everybody's getting along so well? It's a very interesting question about culture. But what I would say is that social and cultural norms are much more elastic than we often think. And even respect to the, I wrote my own thesis on women's rights and women's land rights in post-colonial Morocco and Tunisia. So I think it's a fascinating example of, patriarchal norms being codified somehow as religious norms and then as law. In 1956, Tunisia's first president, Habib Bourguiba, when they won independence officially from France, did a radical thing where he went on television with his wife and he called the Islamic hijab, the scarf, the covering, an odious rag, which is just incredible to think about a president of a Arab Muslim majority country in 1956 going on television and making that statement. And his point was not that he was not a pious Muslim, but he said this is getting in the way of women's advancement, and this is getting in the way of our advancement as a country. And certainly conservative Muslim states did not share that view, but I think it's fascinating in that like that, a culture can shift. And you will rarely find such a stark example, but I think my point is that cultural and social norms are really important and they shouldn't be overlooked. But at the same time, they can't be allowed to violate, the fundamental individual rights of a person just because, the community or the social norms are against them. But there will always be a tension. But I think, we do have this tendency to think of these norms as very rigid and very strong, and sometimes they are, but, in the blink of an eye, they can also be changed and countries can be changed with them. And, it's probably not surprising that after that, Tunisia became one of the most developed countries in the region, and women in that country, while things were not perfect, certainly had stronger women's rights than elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. So, thank you.
Dr. Timan, your final remarks, 1 minute.
No, I'm good, thank
No
you.
remarks.
I think I said.
Dr. Ume, your final remarks, 1 minute.
I'm good. Thank you.
Is that all? Okay, good. Then what is left for us is to say thank you to our panelists on this topic of inclusivity and socioeconomic rights. I want to thank all of them for their presentations and their time. We are glad that we could have the two of you online and then also the two of you in person. Thank you also to the delegates who are ending now at 5:30, 30 minutes late, not in accordance with our schedule, but I think we had a productive day and the presentations were productive. We will convene tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock here in the same venue, where we will have the last 3 sessions and then have the AGM immediately after lunch. All are welcome to participate in the AGM. More details will be provided. Then also, if there are any delegates, participants who have testing requirements in terms of COVID tests and so forth, please let us know so that we assist or facilitate if there is need for that. Good evening. There are three. I think it will.
Just about 30, 45 minutes. Yes, then we'll leave from here, people just go. And then get ready and rest. Your battery is dying. Hi. So maybe to also join Kennedy to thank Rita and Gozi who are online. I think we haven't met for a long time, but it's good that at least we could still hear our voices virtually. So colleagues, what I was saying is this. It could be possible that tomorrow, after the last session just give me a second. The last panel on financial security and illicit financial flows in Africa, that we just have the AGM. Because in most cases, the AGM might just last for about 30 minutes or 45 minutes as we touch on some key issues. And then, of course, we can always elaborate on certain issues during lunch or during the cultural evening when we meet tomorrow. Because we really want to give you enough time that we will leave from here to go to have lunch, and then from there, the rest of the time is ours. Right, so that we don't go back and forth. Right, so we could do that tomorrow, okay? Take care and stay safe, and bye to everyone online. Oh, it's off. Bye-bye, Rita, I can see you now. Cheers, bye-bye. Bye.